Hi, I'm Susan, and today we're talking about breathing. And I've muted other folks just because then you won't be on the recording. So I'm going to talk briefly, and I'm going to lean into James Nestor, who wrote the book Breath recently, and he spent years researching, exploring about what breathing is. And what we know from our practices and from yoga over 2,500 years and from all the meditation is that deep breathing engages the parasympathetic nervous system. So that when we think about the central nervous system, there's the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And when we get anxious and go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, if we have trauma in our past and that gets triggered, then we often lose connection with our breath, and the sympathetic nervous system gets engaged. The panting, the adrenaline, cortisol, body gets tense, digestive system goes offline. So all of those things happen when we get triggered or activated. On the other side, when we engage the parasympathetic nervous system, there's different ways of doing that. A key way is through our breath. And meditation focuses a lot and talks about breath. Now there's this research that's definitive in our Western way, scientific, that shows us different things. So when we're in the parasympathetic nervous system, we're in rest and digest. And this often helps reduce feelings of anxiety. So the rest and digest system lowers the heart rate, reduces blood pressure, and relaxes the muscles in the gastrointestinal. So the opposite of what the sympathetic nervous system when we engage. And a simple way of doing that is building the bridge through the breath. The more often we use it during our day and not just in meditation, the more often we can draw into it. So at the very end, we're going to talk about how do we remember to breathe, because breathing strategies we know help us bring our attention to the present and helps us. So here's what James Nestor says about breathing, some highlights about his research. First of all, breathing through your nostrils with your mouth shut. They looked at 5,400 mammals, and all of them except the dog breathe through the nostrils. And the reason that is because there's a whole filtration system set up here that filters the air, it warms it up, it conditions it. By the time it reaches the lungs, we can access 20% more oxygen than if we're breathing through the mouth. Shallow breathing or breathing through your mouth stresses the body. Slow, deep breathing through the nostrils helps us access more oxygen and slows us down. There's also a balanced level of carbon dioxide, which we breathe out, and breathing oxygen in, that when we breathe through the nostrils, it balances it more effectively. So these are good reasons why we're going to practice and why yogis talk about breathing through the nostrils, both in and out. So the other thing that mouth breathing does is it contributes to hyperventilation. Believe it or not, you can get more viruses or bacteria if your mouth is open. You can breathe in things, whereas if you're breathing, keeping your mouth shut and breathing through the nostrils, then there's this filtration system that decreases your potential to have viruses enter your system. People with, say, something like asthma or a breathing issue, that can actually be helped by learning how to breathe slowly. So there's the physical help, there's the mental help, and there's the emotional help that happens when we learn consistently to breathe slowly. Now, one of you mentioned that as you got older, you find your capacity for breathing deeper is less. And absolutely, the science shows us that the lung capacity decreases. All of our kind of juiciness, right, decreases as we get older. So how do we continue to commit or begin a commitment if we're older? I think that's a wise question, because what we've also found, I say we, like I'm on James Nestor's research team, which I'm not. What James Nestor found was that we can continue to do deep breathing practices and we can still expand our capacity to breathe deeply. We might not have the same, the cilia and the lungs might not kind of move as quickly, they're kind of drying up, but when we continue to breathe more deeply, we can contribute more often to heart beating, slowing down. It benefits the circulation. It helps the digestion. It helps how the brain works. All of those things. They talk about the mind-body connection. I don't know how many of you are following Gabor Mate, his new book, The Myth of Normal. I saw him speak a couple of weeks ago. He's really bringing forward from a medical perspective and a mental health and addiction, how much the medical system has left out the mind-body connection. When we really concentrate on the mind-body connection, what James Nestor says is 80% of the communication comes from the body to the brain. So if that's true, well, let's assume the science is true at this point, then when we're breathing, we're opening up the channels so that the brain is getting a different message when we're breathing consistently, controlled, calm, deep breaths than when we're doing that panting thing like the dogs do. The hyperventilation gives the brain different messages than slow breathing. So they also did a study a number of years ago, says James Nestor, that if the lungs are ailing or shrinking as we age, again, we can expand our capacity to do that. And connected with that is one of the significant markers for longevity was the lung capacity. The larger the lungs, the longer we live. So that's something to kind of consider. Message. And so there's a way that we can count in our breathing that people find very helpful. And not only James Nestor, but Dr. Andrew Weil, you might have heard this, and other breathing experts. Those of you who haven't heard of Dr. Andrew Weil, he's a physician in the States who has made it his life's work to bring breathing forward. Every patient that comes to see him for any issue is strongly encouraged. And he has about 4 practices. He has a website with these practices available. And like James Nestor and others, he says when we breathe in and then expand our out breathing, perhaps 2 counts past our in breath, that is that is a more significant message to the brain. I'm in a relaxed state. Sometimes we need to be in a hyper alert state. Can we be in that state and still do deep breathing? Can we do too much deep breathing? Those are all good questions to ask. So too much deep breathing can cause issues if you do that. But if you keep, which is different than calm, slow, controlled, steady breathing. So today, when we do our practice shortly, what we're going to do is we're going to count to start with. And then I'm going to ask you to find your own rhythm. And so we're going to start with a count of 4 and then expand to 6. But each time we're going to do 2 longer breathing out. So we're going to start with in breath of 4 and out breath of 6. Then we're going to expand to an in breath of 6 and an out breath of 8. Then I'm going to ask you to really feel into your own rhythm. People like to count because it keeps the mind occupied. If you lose count or if you forget to count, as always, I will invite you to come back every couple of moments to conscious awareness of your breathing. And then at the very end, we'll talk about practices that we can do, strategies, tips that we can do to help us remember. Is there any questions before we move into a deeper practice?